Well, I wanted to start by asking you, in an invisible geography, in your bio in the back, you write about your background in prose, particularly you studied fiction, your MFA is in fiction, and you didn't really write poetry until 2010. What inspired you to start?
Well, I wrote poetry in high school, but I guess a lot of people did that. And I wrote poetry and actually won a scholastic prize for one of my poems. And when I think it was a really morbid poem actually about the suicide of valedictorian. And I thought it was a wonderful poem at the time. And now I look at it, it's very embarrassing. And I put poetry away because I was told by someone, you should stick to prose. And this was actually a poetry workshop leader at a summer camp that I went for, gifted and talented students. So I took his word fairly seriously, and I just thought I have no gift for it. I have no business doing it, although I was always reading poetry. So poetry was in my life as something that fed me, but that I was too intimidated by to try writing again for many, many years. What started me writing it was the program at Whitby. We have a strong emphasis on cross-genre work, and what you have to do is take workshops outside of your primary form. And our workshop leader was David Wagner, a poet who I think you probably know. He's from Indiana, but his poems are known in the Pacific Northwest. He's sort of the bard of, the Pacific Northwest poetry scene. And he was a wonderful teacher and just the kind of person who reignited my love for poetry. And I also happened to have him at the time that the earthquake happened in Haiti. And he was the one who encouraged me to write about the tragedy and the frustration and the anger, the mix of confusing feelings that I really had, and try to express that through poetry.
Why poetry to respond to the earthquake?
I think prose, in a way, it demanded another part of my brain. It's almost like writing my dissertation is a different kind of writing, and that sort of linear, and it's not always linear, but that kind of thinking wasn't the way I felt I could best respond in words. So poetry allowed me to have the ability to work just with images, with fragments, to take them apart, put them together, and also it felt closer to the body. The way poetry can feel like singing, like breathing, follows the heartbeat. That's, I think, why I responded in poetry and not in prose. Although I did write some things in prose as well.
It makes me think of a line in one of your poems. Prose is a wish to travel in a straight line. Poetry is a ladder to heaven.
Yes.
And I thought it was such an interesting line because you put it in a prose poem.
Exactly. That's exactly why it's there, because I don't entirely believe that, but I do understand, again, it's that idea of category, that we have to create categories. And so the writer, even being called a poet or being called a prose writer, I think most of us think or work in both forms naturally, but we find that we need to fit somewhere or identify with a certain group. And for me, prose poetry was a way to maybe defy that and not accept those boundaries. So that's exactly why that line is in a prose poem. And that prose poem was inspired by Anne Carson's work. And Anne Carson is a writer, I think, who really blurs those boundaries well.
Language is something that comes into play in all of your work, but I'm thinking specifically of your short story Departure Lounge, where the speaker is afraid she's going to be caught because she actually doesn't know Creole.
Exactly.
But there's this way that she does know Creole.
Exactly.
She can understand it, but she can't speak it.
Right.
I was just curious to hear you talk a little bit about the way this vexed, you use the word vexed relationship to language has affected your own writing, or maybe even just Haitian writing in general.
Well, I think it's affected Haitian writing in general. I would say that, of course, larger question for any writer who is of African descent, who was taken from Africa and brought to another place, you will always have the loss of whatever the original language was. So that loss is not going to be recovered. So the Haitians were taken from areas, Benin, Nigeria, etc., and they had to create a new language in Haiti so that they could understand each other, which is also why the Haitian Revolution, by the way, worked, because there was a way of communicating among all the slaves who'd been taken from different parts of Africa. So the idea of creating one's own language because you cannot rely on something else is natural and part of the resourcefulness and resilience of what goes on in the Caribbean and in lots of other places. So in that, it's not new. My situation, having been born in France, the first language I heard was French, but then I moved to Canada and Quebec. So what I heard was a very different kind of French, but all of that is associated with intimacy. So Haitian Creole and French, to me, are the languages of family and intimacy. And then the official language became English, because that was the language that I had to learn when we moved to Ontario. And when I came to the US, I had a Canadian accent. And you can imagine how popular that made me. People make fun of me all the time. And that was another language learning experience, because then I had to switch from that kind of English into non-Canadian acceptable English. So I've kind of had these steps and transformations along the way many times. And I think I was just trying to dramatize that particular in that story on the border, because I'm on the border of lots of languages and I feel most comfortable in English. But even within English, there are different kinds of Englishes that we're speaking. So I always view language as something in motion and something growing and something in flux.
There's a lot of searching
Absolutely.
in an invisible geography. And I'm wondering if this is related to you identifying as a diasporic writer.
Yes.
And what kind of influence that's had on your writing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's had a lot of influence on my writing, but first came the searching just in terms of travel and geography. So where did I feel most comfortable? What felt like a landscape that was a nurturing landscape or community? And I lived in different places, including in Europe, the West Coast, the Bay Area. So I think moving to the Midwest was not something I ever expected. And because of that, I actually learned a lot more about the United States being in the Midwest and my own stereotypes about the Midwest as flyover country. And I started to examine myself and the way I viewed other communities, whether it was abroad or here in the US, and my own stereotypes. And that was part of what I think I was trying to do too. I'm searching for the things that prevent me from seeing the communities I live in.
How do you see writing as part of your activism, if you see it as part of your activism?
It's interesting because I don't feel I'm involved in a lot of things, actually. I wish I were involved in more, to be honest, because everything I've been involved with feels as if it's a response that is to something that I feel passionately about, but the long-term work is being done by the people that we don't see, and they're not on camera. They're not the ones, when they're going to film Sean Penn in front of his, they're not going to be there. And yet those people were the ones that I met when I was there. And knowing that that work continues and that they continue to do the hardest work out of the limelight, I just feel that whatever I can do to support the people who are really working is what I do. And so the writing, in this sense, is my way of supporting work that's going on with the tools that I have. which is the ability to do certain things with the English language. And the people I really admire are doing a lot harder work.